We're going to be taking a look at 6 verses in the book of Numbers, chapter 21, and we're going to be looking at one of my favorite micro stories from this entire book. And it's going to be none other than the bronze serpent, or the Nachash Nachashet. And when you read John chapter 3, and of course everybody's heard of John 3:16, for God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, that none may perish but have everlasting life, for those who believe in him. To help set up and tee up that exact verse, of course, that he uses, he actually makes reference to this story in the book of Numbers, that just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so too must the Son of Man be lifted up. And so I remember making that connection when I was a teenager, when I came through and read these few verses, like, oh, that's what Jesus was talking about. And if I could kind of slip in an additional title or just a little bit of information here about these 6 verses, I would actually call it pharmakon. And pharmakon is actually this Greek word that means the poison and the cure. And I think the reason for that will become a little bit self-evident later on, but this really truly is the case of where the problem is also the solution. And of course, when we get to this verse, it says in verse 4 that the people became very discouraged along the way. And of course, there have already been a number of discouraging items and situations that have happened. You know, when they decided to move from the base of Sinai, they went ahead and sent out a dozen representatives or spies to go scope out the land. And of course, after it had been 40 days, they come back, and 10 of those 12 decide to give almost this disheartening, scathing review of the land about how the people there's just no way, no how, it's not going to be achievable. And of course, Joshua and Caleb are like, this is the same God that delivered us from Egypt, did all the signs, wonders, plagues, miracles, crossed the Red Sea, we've been getting the manna, we've seen everything we did at Sinai. That same God then, who done all those things, will make good on his word, make good on his promise, and deliver us to the land just as long as we're faithful. But it was too little, too late, and the people's heart already melted within them like wax. Other episodes that we find, of course, you know, the people are getting disheartened because of the food situation. They're not getting every single thing that they want, though they are getting everything that they need, both food and water. You know, they're not having banquets and they're not having feasts every night. And a lot of the times when the people have rabbled and reveled about what they don't have, something's always happened. There was a group of people that talked about how we had cucumbers and melons and leeks and garlic and all the wonderful things back in Egypt. You know, it's interesting that the foods that they talked about are things that reach deep into the earth and root themselves in this world, because it was a physical representation of what their soul was. And they were craving all of those items. They were craving those things. And they were talking about how much they didn't like the food that came from heaven, that heavenly bread and the manna. Well, wouldn't you know, as we get into verse 5, it talks about the people spoke against God and Moses, saying, why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There's no food, no water, and our soul loathes this worthless bread. How many times at this point, even in the book of Numbers, have they talked about, well, the only reason you brought us out here is because there's no graves left in Egypt? That's already been said a multitude of times. And then when it says there's no food and no water, again, that's their appetite speaking. You know, there is a difference. Even though they seem to be the same, your appetite and your hunger, there is a difference. Appetite is kind of a thing where it talks about the things that you would desire, the things that you would prefer. A lot of times when you're hungry, as long as it's food, have at it. Hunger tells you you need something. Appetite kind of dictates what it is that you want. The book of Proverbs warns against, when you're in the presence of the king, put a knife to your throat if you're a man given to your appetite, not your hunger. And when it says there's no water, you know, it talks about Israel being disheartened. Moses himself's already disheartened, and he's been disheartened. Just in the chapter prior, one of the things that heavy on the nation, not just Moses himself, is when you start off the chapter, you find there's the death of Miriam, his sister. And wouldn't you know, after she died, it doesn't say anybody mourned her. The very first thing it says after she died is the fact that Israel, just like a dog on a bone, decided to jump on them and gripe about their water situation, thus resulting in him hitting and striking the rock as opposed to just speaking to it. That's what barred him from the promised land. And I'm sure that was a bummer on all else. And then you find in the chapter, right at the same chapter, right at the end of it, Aaron also dies. And then, of course, it moves on to say that our souls loathe this worthless bread. When I read this verse, when it says that their souls loathed this worthless bread, keep in mind what gave them sustenance all this time. In many ways, it was this bread. That's what kept them alive, and that was what was sustaining them to God's fulfilled promise on the other side. But boy, when I see that they say their soul itself, their innermost being, turns its nose up at this worthless bread, they're skating on thin ice. And it might just be recency bias, but this makes me think of Korah. I had mentioned before, if you recall, that Korah's name means balding or baldness. Now, here's the stretch, how we're going to reach why I'm thinking that. Well, think of Korah's situation. He was already in a very elite and prestigious job. He already had something that was not common by any stretch of the imagination, and it was one of the most respected positions you could be in and have. Working with the items, the most holy items on this planet, and transporting them, covering them, all the furnishments, he wanted more. And as my own kids would profess to you, he did not stay in his lane, and when he did not stay in his lane, he went head on with God, and it cost him his life. He was swallowed up. And with his name meaning baldness, it makes me think of him stepping outside of bounds, and he began to lose, as balding does, began to lose that coverage, that blessing, that hedge of protection. And so Israel now, just like Korah did, they've lost that hedge of protection. So the earth ain't going to come split open and swallow the people up, but instead we're going to find that the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people. And it says they bit the people, and many of the people of Israel died. Therefore people came to Moses and said, "We know we have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord that he might take away the serpents from us." So Moses prayed for the people. And it's funny that this is all talking about food and the things that people take into themselves, and willingly, not willingly, will, won't. Because you go back to Eden, you go back to the beginning in the garden, what was the whole debacle there? It was a play on the food, and people had hunger, but it was what appealed to their appetite, and that's what got them kicked out of paradise. That's how they got ate out of home. And here we find that kind of similar situation in this similar vein. And it says they got the fiery serpents. And look here too. It says here that pray that the Lord will take the serpents away from us. Do we find that happening? No. You're still in the storm. You're still having to face the consequences. But now there is going to be a new established way for you to navigate through that issue. But you have to keep your focus, because it says the Lord said to Moses, "Make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole, and it shall be that everyone who is bitten, when he looks at it, they shall live." In Israel every day, they're sick of seeing this manna. They're sick of seeing the same thing. That's an established fact. And I kind of find it humorous in one way, shape, that the solution is the problem. They're tired of the manna. They don't want to look at the manna. Well, now they've got a real problem in facing these serpents, and probably the last thing they would ever want to see to be a solution is yet another serpent, because they've already had way more than enough of those. And it's interesting because a couple thousand years later, we find Israel in a very subjugated state. They're underneath the Romans. They've had, a lot of history of back and forth. They've lost the temple. They had it rebuilt. They're not too far from losing the second temple. And you would take a look at the situation, and the last thing they would probably feel they would need is another man. And yet that was the solution. And yet that is what God is going to lift up to reconcile and bring us to him. And it says here that Moses made a bronze serpent, put it on a pole, and so it was if a serpent had bitten anyone, when he looked at the bronze serpent, he lived. Did he remove the problem? No. But did he create a solution to preserve through the problem? Yes. And it goes back to this idea, this concept of pharmakon, meaning that the problem is the solution. The poison has a cure, and it's the same thing. There's a few things I want us to take a look at. How interesting, as I said, is it that we go back to the problem of serving our appetite instead of serving the hunger, and that's what unleashes all of these problems. It has this just complete, eradicated undoing of everything that's supposed to be set in place. Now, when you take a look at this word nachash, it's a 3-letter word, nun, ket, shin. And if you look at their gematria, which is, again, just the numeric value, each letter has a set number assigned to it, or it has a numeric equivalence. And those 3 letters come together for a total of 358. And of course, we were talking about John chapter 3, about how Christ, Messiah, about how when he is lifted up, he would have to be lifted up, just like Moses did in the serpent in the wilderness. And of course, we know that Christ came to this world to help take care of the sin problem. One of the things I'll mention too, that is the word Messiah, or Mashiach, is a 4-letter word, mem, shin, yud, ket. The numeric value of that word also is 358. And that could tell us that every bit of foil and every bit of damage is brought back into an equal balance by the works of the Messiah, the works of Christ. Another thing I want to bring to your attention to, it talks about how the serpent was lifted up on a pole. That word pole is the word nes. And nes, we found it in various places before because it also translates as to banner, pole, obviously it means flag, but there's also another word that nes means, and it's the word miracle. And I want you to think about this whole thing, and obviously it was a miraculous circumstance that as the people are facing these serpents, they're facing these fangs, people are dropping dead left and right. And it was a miracle that the solution to this problem was to cast and create this metallic serpent that when the people would look up and view it, they would be fine. That's how pharmakon would work. And it was a miracle. And to me, it's just mind-blowing to think that miracle and nes, you put the serpent up as a miracle, that is going to be a miracle. But it also makes me think of the times where, even in my own personal life, I have seen incredible things happen. I have had incredible connections, incredible circumstances. God has shown up and shown out in a lot of ways. So what should our response be when that happens? Well, what do you do with the flag? Every day that I go to work, one of the things I've got to do is drive by a flagpole. And what happens there? Those things are lifted up high and proud. And they're above most everything else, waving, representing their freedoms, and showing, lifting up, whether it's a state, whether it's the nation. Or I would feel in this case, like a flag is lifted up, what are we to do? If we have a miracle, we show it off. And I do think there are miracles that we keep to ourselves. I know my very first sermon that I'd ever done was the whole thing about my story in the golf ball. And I kept that with me for about 3 months without telling a soul. And I think it's adequate, and I think it's private. If it's something holy to you, you don't have to broadcast it to the entire world. But if there is a circumstance to where you have a miracle, even if it's just between you and God, make sure you lift it up like a banner in praise. And the last thing I want to touch on before we close out is this phrase, bronze serpent. And in the Hebrew, bronze serpent, it's literally nachash, nachashet. It's two words, and those two words have identical spellings, other than the fact that nachashet has one extra letter to it, and that's the letter tav. And one of the things I'll say in regards to that, you've already heard me say before, that all Hebrew letters have this almost pictographic meaning. They symbolize or they represent this thought, this concept, this idea, and not just for decades, not just for centuries, but for millennia. These letters have had these quote-unquote hidden meanings or alternate meanings. In the ancient form for the tav, which is the final letter of the Hebrew alphabet, to write this letter, it was to create two intersecting lines, or a cross. Literally, a cross. The idea behind the letter is that of a covenant. And one of the things I think of when I read this story is, what was the solution? To put this serpent on a pole, put it on a nes, lift it up. Literally, the word nachashet is taking the word nachash, serpent, and putting it to a cross. And I just think that is something that's beautiful, because what do we have to do? We have to face the serpent in our life, whether that's the serpents that our mouth ourselves has spoken to existence. I have to think of King Saul. When he was anointed as king, not everybody was thrilled at that decision. Regardless of people's feelings, one of the things that happened was his first conflict and strife as king was to deal with somebody by the name of Nahash. Well, what does Nahash mean? Serpent. And so whether you're Adam and Eve in the garden, or whether you're the very first king of Israel, whether you're Moses casting this, or whether you're speaking this message, or you're listening to this message today, one of the central things you and I have to learn to do is to put that serpent itself on the cross, to let it die. And just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so too must the Son of Man be lifted up, because God loved not just the Jews, not just the Hebrews, but for the entire world, that we may have life if we believe in him. Because as Pharmakon states, the poison is the cure, and the cure is the poison. So as always, thank you for your time. Be blessed.